All right, so I have worked quite a lot actually with our second speaker today during her time here at UC Berkeley, and I'm really happy to have her join us here today. Throughout her time working toward her PhD here, Lucy Gill has spent a lot of hours actually working with K-12 teachers, helping them expand their understanding of Mesoamerica prior to European settlement. And so Lucy's research sits at the intersection of, and this is a little bit of a mouthful, but I'm using her words here because I think they're quite descriptive, the intersection of anthropological archaeology and historical ecology. She employs community-based participatory research practices as the foundation for empirically rigorous data collection and theoretical formulation. She co-directs a project called the Darien Profundo, a collaborative project based in Eastern Panama, which employs community mapping, paleoecology, and ethnography, in addition to archaeological field and laboratory methods to document the deep local history of Darien province. She's also worked in Belize, Guatemala, Mexico, Nicaragua, and elsewhere in the US. And so I want to say welcome to Lucy, and also suggest that you may have questions for her about her talk, but you might also have questions for her about her research methods, because I think what she's describing is a model for learning about the past of other places that moves away from some of the things that might frustrate you about, I don't know, a look at places that don't incorporate the knowledge of people who live there. So I will pass it to you, Lucy, with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane, for the introduction. Yeah, as Shane said, I've had the good fortune to work with her a lot, which has been one of my favorite parts of my time at Berkeley so far. So first of all, yeah, feel free to ask me questions about obviously what I present today, which will not be about my project in Eastern Panama. It will be about another project that I've worked on in the state of Tlaxcala in Mexico. But feel free to ask me questions about Panama, about other work that I've done with teachers, and please feel free to interrupt me during my presentation to put questions in chat, or raise your hand. I'm happy to sort of have this be more of a dialogue. And then obviously I certainly left enough time for questions at the end as well. All right, so today I will be talking about colonialism and climate, agroecological ingenuity in the Tlaxcalan Little Ice Age. And so as the last presenter, I only caught the very end of his talk, but also really emphasize sort of human agency and how people were able to sort of innovate in response to climatic changes, which should give us hope for our present day situation. I'm going to try to sort of incorporate that as well, and really talk about the intersection between colonialism and climate change. So social and environmental factors, which is sort of a feature of my research. This talk is really going to focus on the colonial era, since that is the era of the Little Ice Age in Mexico. However, most of my research has actually been on the pre-Hispanic period in the Americas. And so again, if you have questions about that, feel free to ask as well. So the picture in the background that you can see there is obviously, you can see a volcano. This is taken from the site that I was working at, which I'll talk about a bit later, called Tepeticpac, kind of a mouthful. And it was one of the sort of 4 altepetl, which are the communities that comprised the state of Tlaxcala. And the point of showing this picture is really just to look at the topography. So you can see I'm up on top of a hill, which is where all of these settlements were located. You can see now this sort of city down here is what is now the capital of Tlaxcala. And that was the capital created by the Spanish, which was situated in the floodplain. And as you may imagine, especially during the Little Ice Age, that caused a series of problems, including flooding that I will touch on later. But just so you can sort of get a sense of the topography, it's quite variable. And the word Tlaxcala, Tlaxcala is how it's pronounced today. The Nahuatl pronunciation would have been Tlaxcala, and that means actually like place of the corn tortilla. So Tlaxcali are tortillas, and then adding the A is like the place where they come from. So just to sort of situate you a little bit in case you're not familiar with Tlaxcala, I think hopefully I can make the case to you that it's an interesting sort of case study, um, particularly for teachers who are teaching about, the Aztec and the Spanish conquest in general, because as you can see here, Tlaxcala was situated right in the middle of this green, which was the Aztec Empire. So it was this tiny state that retained its independence in the midst of this vast, vast empire. And as you may imagine, the Aztecs were constantly sort of infringing on their territory, and fought a series of wars with Tlaxcala called the Flower Wars, which actually, those wars, the people that were taken captive in those wars were often the people that then the Aztecs would take captive to employ in their sacrifice rituals. So the Tlaxcalans really did not have a good relationship with the Aztec Empire, as you might imagine. And so when the Spanish came, the Tlaxcalans actually sort of saw an opportunity to, potentially have this ally to fight with them against the Aztec. And I mean, they didn't do so immediately. They actually fought against Cortez and his army when he first came. And then they sort of realized, wow, like the Spaniards are actually pretty good fighters and we could really use them. So they sort of saw this as a military opportunity. And because of that, and in many ways, they were pretty responsible for the success of the Spaniards against the Aztec. Because as you may imagine, unlike the Spanish, the Tlaxcalans actually had a lot of experience fighting in this region. They had a lot more resources, a lot more men, a lot more animals, everything. So, in many ways, they're very responsible for the success of the Spanish. And with that came certain privileges. So they retained their independence even after the Spanish conquest. And so Tlaxcala is still a state in the Republic of Mexico, but it's sort of maintained its autonomy to varying degrees throughout its history. So I'll talk a little bit about how that has coincided with the time of the Little Ice Age. So this is an image from the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, which actually this is from the Bancroft Library. They have one of the facsimiles of this, which has been an amazing resource. But you can see in the bottom right, that's Cortez. And then here are some soldiers from Tlaxcala who he's collaborating with. But because Tlaxcala retained its independence or autonomy, again, to varying degrees, they actually have a lot of written documents that exist from Tlaxcala that were written in Nahuatl, but have since been translated into Spanish and English. And unlike many of the other indigenous codices, again, because of their relationship with Spanish, they weren't burned. And so they exist to this day. And so these, in my experience, have been a really good sort of primary source for teachers, because it actually, they were written, again, in Nahuatl, so in the indigenous language by indigenous leaders. And so that provides a really unique perspective of, written words produced by indigenous people, which was pretty uncommon in terms of these things actually surviving to the present day. And so one of these really important documents is what's called the Tlaxcalan Actas, which is basically the city council meetings, minutes of the city council meetings. It's the only known set of these minutes from all of Spanish colonial Mexico. And so this particular set of them goes from 1545 to 1627. So this is just a subset of the cover that I'm showing you there. A subset of these that have been translated into English. There are many, many more that have been translated into Spanish and English from later periods as well. And these were really helpful in terms of reconstructing what's actually going on for your average person, right? They talk a lot about the introduction of European domesticates, so sheep, goats, pigs, cows. I'll talk a little bit about that later. They talk a lot about various epidemics that people were facing and how to deal with that. And they talk about various types of agriculture and how they're planning in response to the Little Ice Age, among other things. So again, just to give you a little bit of a zoomed in map of Tlaxcala, as I said, it was divided into these four communities. Altepetl is that the Nahuatl word for that. So this is sort of your classic Western map of these four communities. Here you have, this is north is up. Tlaxcala, the Spanish capital, is right here. I've drawn in one of the very important rivers here, which you can see divides the communities into, west and east. Tepeticpac is the community that I'll talk the most about, since that's where I've actually done archaeological work myself. And then you can see there are these three other communities. And as I mentioned, they were all situated on hilltops, basically surrounding this floodplain. So, this has been for a long time a highly variable environment climatically. And so, there were always floods, there were always droughts. And so it, sort of made sense for people to live at sort of the higher altitudes. Obviously, also, if you're facing invasions from the Aztec, it makes sense to sort of situate yourself at a high point, which gives you a bit of a military advantage. This, unfortunately, is a little bit blurry, but this is actually a map of Tlaxcala created by some of the leaders of the community. So this is a sort of indigenous view of Tlaxcala. So as you can see, it's again divided into four parts, but in this case, actually, this is west down here and east is up here. And as you can see, this map is really centered around this river right here, which is the Zahuapan River, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And just for sort of reference, this down here is Tepeticpac. So that's where I was standing in that first sort of vista picture that I showed you. So what I'm going to be talking about today comes from a variety of sources, some archaeological, some historical, some environmental. But my sort of primary involvement in it has been working on the Proyecto de Arqueología Cotidiana de Tepeticpac. So archaeological project, cotidiana is like quotidian. So the idea behind this project is really to investigate the daily life of people living in Tepeticpac. And we are particularly focused on the transition between, the sort of pre-Hispanic, Hispanic period transition, which also happens to coincide very well with the Little Ice Age in Mexico. So it's directed by a professor at McGill University named Dr. Lisa Overholzer. And this is one of her photos taken with a drone of Tepeticpac, and specifically of these terraces here. And so these were terraces where people were living and farming. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. We excavated specifically one neighborhood here, which is called Coyotepetl. Petl is just sort of like community. Coyote obviously is coyote. So named for the coyote, which does still live in the area. And so, yeah, basically what we encountered were domestic structures, which I'll show you. And then we also encountered house garden plots. And so how people were mostly farming when the Spaniards first arrived and continuing for the next 100, 150 years or so, were in these sort of small plots right outside of their homes. So, there wasn't this huge separation between where people were living and where people were farming. That comes later and brings with it all sorts of problems, actually. So you can see here's the excavation units, and these are the outlines of three different structures. Hopefully you can see here, sort of what you would expect. Four walls, look pretty similar to a house today. And then you can see in this one, it's kind of interesting. We found actually four hearths. So, and these are oriented towards the cardinal directions. So this, these would have been where people are cooking, and we actually think that each of these hearths, based on radiocarbon dating, corresponds to a different sort of period of occupation. So, people were living and using one of these, then people, built another one later on and sort of, yeah, changed their orientation towards one of the different cardinal directions. So just to give you a sense of what doing archaeology looks like, the other notable thing about this picture is, this was again taken with a drone. The other notable thing about this picture are these maguey plants, which I will talk about later on, which were very important. They are indigenous to this area, but the way that they were cultivated changed dramatically at about 1650, which corresponded with sort of more increased Spanish involvement in the region and less autonomy. And that brought with it all sorts of issues. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the period that I'm going to talk about and what sort of happened climatically during this period, because as I'm sure you've learned, the Little Ice Age had very different manifestations in different parts of the world. And so, there do seem to be climatic shifts that take place almost globally during this time period, but exactly which years and exactly what happened differs significantly from place to place. So this graph just sort of very simply shows both precipitation and temperature. So as you can see here, the gray bars are cold anomalies, and then the black here is precipitation anomalies. So yes, so as you can see here, right, the sort of coldest years first are from about 1540s is when sort of the Little Ice Age in Mexico starts. And you have significant cold periods up until about 1700, although not all of the time. And then precipitation sometimes correlates with that, although precipitation mostly is concentrated from about 1585 here to 1629. And then again, precipitation becomes a huge factor in this later period from about 1660 to 1704. And during this time is when you actually see more of the environmental changes becoming problematic. So if you read my little abstract for my talk, during this first period, we actually see that the communities in Tlaxcala were able to cope very well with these changes in environment, even though they were pretty extreme, and brought with them, epidemics, all sorts of things. And then during this later period is when we start to see there actually being issues, and that's because they're also that is correlated with a period of significant political change that makes it much more difficult for communities to cope with these changes. So I'll show you sort of little bits of this throughout. I'm going to go through it in like 6 chunks, but just to sort of give you an overview of what to expect. And then you can see here, we get, a period of actually drought down here. And then we get more flooding again in the early 1800s. And as I'll mention, flooding continues to be a problem in this area today. And a lot of that is due to hydrological changes that took place during this time period. Yes, they are in degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you for that question. Okay, so again, these are sort of the way that I've broken it up. I've marked Tlaxcala with a big yellow star there. And you can see here, all right. So 1516 to 1525 is sort of the period of Spain's initial involvement in Mexico. And you can see that this correlated with an extremely dry period. So again, the sort of Little Ice Age period starts here in about 1540. And so, yeah, the Spaniards entered into this very, very dry landscape. And again, this is the same picture that I showed you early on, but it perhaps was the result of it being very dry that the Spaniards initially chose to build their capitals, not just in Tlaxcala, but in many parts of Mexico, in floodplain environments. So again, once the Little Ice Age started, this caused all sorts of problems. But you can imagine that when it was dry, it seemed quite easy to build capitals in very flat areas, a lot easier in terms of construction. So the other thing that I'm going to talk about sort of in this initial period, there was this big industry that developed around what's called cochineal. So you might have heard of this because it's also a paint color. Yes, so the indigenous settlements were on hills. So if we go back, again, this is sort of, I'm taking the photo from Tepetitlac, which is one of these indigenous settlements. There's also another one up on this hill over here. And there's the others are, you can't see them, but they're over there on the other side of the floodplain in that area. So when the Spaniards first arrived, one of the first things that they sort of remarked upon was the production of this particular dye called cochineal. So that's also the name of the paint color associated with it, which you can see here in this very famous Rembrandt portrait. The red gown that this woman is wearing is painted with cochineal. And one of the sort of common misconceptions about pre-Hispanic Mesoamerica is that they didn't really domesticate animals. They in fact did, so they domesticated turkeys, although it's argued that they didn't really change their morphology that much, and so it's not like true domestication in the way that, you know, an auroch looks very different from a domestic cow, or a wild boar looks very different from a domestic pig. But they domesticated a lot of other animals as well, including these insects that you can see here, which were cultivated on these particular species of cacti, which were also domesticated. So the wild varieties of both this type of cactus and this type of insect, the insect does produce some dye, but not nearly in the quantities that they were cultivating. And they have actually a parasitic relationship with these cacti. So basically, they will live on the cacti, and then they'll eventually, in not too much time, kill the cactus by sort of sucking out all of its juice. And that's actually how they become red, is they suck out the juice of this cactus. So that obviously is not sustainable because the plant will die, right? And so it's not going to sort of regenerate, and you're not going to get sort of large scale collection of this dye. So people actually figured out how to cultivate a type of cactus, a variety of this cactus that was a little bit hardier, so going to withstand more of the sort of sucking out of these insects. And then they would pluck them off and harvest them and grind them into dye before they killed the cactus. So they would sort of have a lot of cacti growing at different phases, and then they would remove the insects and allow them to sort of regenerate. So this actually necessitated a ton of human involvement. It was a very intensive practice. And this dye in Tlaxcala was used in the creation of these codices, including the one I showed you earlier, the Lienzo de Tlaxcala. They would use it as a painting dye, basically. They would also use it to dye fabric, and actually it works a lot better on fabric than it does on paper. And so, but it was, produced in significant but not extremely large quantities. But when the Spaniards arrived, they saw that this dye was much better than any of the red colors that they were able to produce in Europe. So I forget exactly what they were using at the time, but the red dyes that they were producing, I think, were mostly from fruits, and they faded very quickly. So you would have to repaint them. And if you were painting fabric or dyeing fabric, it would wash out very quickly. And you were left with kind of a very pale, not vibrant color. And so they were very impressed by this rich color that was being produced. And they started paying for it in mass and having it shipped back to Europe. And so it features in many paintings from this time, including in Rembrandt's work. They actually did chemical analysis to demonstrate that this was made from this particular species of cochineal bug. Very cool. But as you might imagine, that necessitated production in much, much larger quantities. And so that didn't actually have the devastating environmental effects that you might expect, which for reasons that I'll talk about quickly. Here, so this is from a quote from the Tlaxcalan Actas, which I showed you earlier. It's these like city council minutes. So this one I think is worth reading in full because it's, I think, very evocative. It's also, if you read the whole thing, this is just a small excerpt. It's written in very sort of florid language, which again has been translated into English, but was originally written down in Nahuatl. So this is a city council member sort of reflecting on this newly developed cochineal industry. Everyone does nothing but take care of cochineal cactus. No longer is care taken that maize and other edibles are planted. They no longer want to cultivate their fields, but idly neglect them. Because of this, now many fields are going to grass, and famine truly impends. Things are no longer as they were long ago, for the cochineal cactus is making people lazy. Some of the men hire themselves out to Spaniards to gather dye for them, and they give them money and cacao. And of those who hire themselves out, many are likewise ruined, because some act as slaves in the hands of the Spaniards. If it were not for cochineal, they would not become such. Many sins are committed there, and it all comes from cochineal. For before cochineal was known and everyone planted cochineal cactus, it was not this way. So this was from March 3rd, 1553. And as you can see, there's sort of an interesting conflation of this new industry with sort of Spanish intervention in general. And so they're talking about this industry, but also they're talking about colonialism and how this is sort of changing the way that people are behaving. And so as I mentioned earlier, people were originally, like what we find in that very early colonial period site, is that people are cultivating plants in very small quantities around their homesteads. But then you start to see people, because the demand is such for these very particular crops, you start to see people cultivating basically monocultures, and as they say, neglecting other types of planting. And what that means is that, there are a lot of fields that are sort of left empty, which actually wasn't a big environmental problem, but was a problem from the perspective of things sort of changing sociopolitically and people being less able to rely on the foods that they were themselves cultivating. So less sort of subsistence farming going on. But in about 1545, you have the start of the Little Ice Age in Mexico. And with that comes extensive precipitation, which lead to huge flood events, and also frosts, unseasonable frosts. And the cochineal cactus and the cochineal insect were both very, very susceptible to those environmental effects. And so this, what had been this huge industry is really, dramatically impacted by these climatic shifts. And so that actually was a good thing because this industry, as a sort of extensive monoculture that again, the city council members had seen as really harmful to their lifestyle, sort of fell apart, and people sort of went back to their subsistence farming, and it seemed like everything was going okay. Because they had built their settlements in these hills, they weren't actually very susceptible to floods. The area at the time was surrounded by these extensive wetlands. So this is from one of the 2 wetlands that still remain. Most of these have been drained, which I'll also talk about, but this is from one of them that remains today. It's called Atlantepec. And so, as you might imagine, if you have a river with extensive wetlands around it, these sort of prevent mass flooding, right? Because you get sort of the vegetation prevents that from happening, and also prevents there from being as much erosion. It's sort of a layer of protection between the river and the land where people are living. So people actually, are able to cope pretty well with these large flooding events. Right, I will answer that at the end of it. The other interesting thing is that people were making use of European domesticate animals, but at this time only in ways that were pretty sustainable. So you see the introduction of pigs, and they refer to them in the actas as cerdos de la tierra. And de la tierra is like from the earth, but is only otherwise used to refer to native plants and animals. So it's kind of interesting that they call these pigs native. They know that they're not, obviously, but it seems like from the way that they're described, they were able to be integrated so well into the types of cultivation systems that had already been established, that they weren't, they didn't need to sort of create new types of industry around them in the way that they did for sheep much later, which I'll talk about. So these are just a couple of pig bones that I found in our excavations. And pigs were actually the only type of European domesticate that we encountered in our excavations, because they can very easily live in these sorts of wetland environments, and they're very sort of minimally impactful in small numbers. And there's actually some scholars that have hypothesized that it might have actually been Asian hogs that were imported during this time, perhaps from the Philippines, since the Spaniards were also involved there, rather than the European breeds, because the European breeds tend to live in more sort of wooded environments, and the Asian hogs, as you might imagine, being in island environments, tend to live in more sort of wetlands. And we know from these documents that these pigs were kept in wetlands, basically. So we don't know that, but it's one sort of hypothesis. But anyway, these creatures were kept and were super resilient to these massive flooding events. If anything, they enjoyed it, and so you see sort of the selective adoption of certain European domesticates and not others during this time. There was, however, disease that was exacerbated by these climatic events. And so these are just a few images from various codices around Mexico, where you see sort of how these symptoms of various plagues are depicted. So there was a huge epidemic in 1545, so right around the time of those first huge flooding events, that depopulated Mexico by about 50%, which included about 150,000 deaths in Tlaxcala. So obviously very relevant today, since we're living through another climate exacerbated zoonotic epidemic. But what's kind of interesting is that, so smallpox was also a problem, and smallpox did cause one of these large epidemic events. But we don't actually think that it caused this particular epidemic in 1545, which was referred to as Cocolistli, which means like the sickness in Nahuatl. We think, based on the excavation of burials that were from cemeteries that were infected with these bacteria, that this was actually an endogenous, so a native hemorrhagic fever virus. So this was probably not actually a plague introduced by the Spaniards, but it was certainly a plague that was exacerbated by these extremely wet conditions, which lead to, a lot more mosquito larvae, so a lot more mosquito-borne diseases. They also caused a huge fluorescence in like rodent populations. So that led to a lot more, viruses that were spread via rodents as vectors. And so just a lot more sort of epidemics in general. And so there is pretty good correlation between the outbreaks of disease in Tlaxcala between 1519 and 1810, and these climatic anomalies. Again, there were also stressors that were introduced by the Spanish, which exacerbated this. So, but it's not as simple as, the Spaniards brought all of the diseases in the way that it's often sort of depicted. So the next sort of climatic period is 1605 to 1614, which was really the height of these extreme precipitation events. And then after that, until the 1650s, it was still extremely cold and extremely wet. And so even though the sort of precipitation itself had stopped, you still get sort of lingering precipitation. And so during this time period, you also start to see more sort of active Spanish involvement and less autonomy given to the indigenous people of Tlaxcala. So as I mentioned earlier, maguey was a really important plant. You can see here people stripping maguey fibers, which were used in weaving, and then here spinning the fibers into thread. These are sort of the archaeological signatures of that process. This is the tool that's used for stripping, and this is a spindle whorl that's used for weaving. So this was a really important plant. It was also used to produce pulque, which is an alcoholic beverage. But during this time period, so about 1650, you start to see excessive cultivation of maguey specifically for pulque. Yes, the spindle whorl is used for spinning. Yeah. And so you start to see these huge monocultures of this plant that were sort of directed by the Spanish when they sort of started to more centrally plan the various communities. They sort of directed this region to be the producer of maguey. And so you see these in this bottom right picture, this specific type of maguey cultivation called metepantli. And this is a system that was never used prior to the Spaniard arrival, where you get these sort of berms that are created, these sort of high points where these are planted, and then you get these spaces in between. And as you can see, this whole area has been cleared, right? So no trees and no other plants. And what this means is that you need extensive tending of these plots. Otherwise, you're going to get just massive erosion. And that is in fact what happened when you get the sort of continuation of these pluvial floods, is you see sort of huge denudation of hillsides. And so this is like an interesting example. This is a contemporary photo, but half of this hillside has sort of been restored and half is still sort of being used for this type of very, very intensive agriculture. And you start to see basically all of this sediment flowing down from these hillsides and silting up the wetlands that I showed you earlier, so filling those in. And you see yeah, just massive vegetation. It's sort of a positive feedback thing. Once you start to clear these hillsides, then no vegetation, then all of the sort of agriculturally supportive sediment, the organic rich material flows away, and then nothing can grow there. So you get these just barren hillsides, which is often what you see today in Tlaxcala, fortunately. And this is sort of, donkeys were used to bring this pulque then from these maguey fields to centers where it would be traded. And again, that sort of all started to be controlled by the Spanish. And this also meant that people were, again, farming further and further away from their homes. So they were, less able to sort of manage the fields as well, which again caused all sorts of problems. So then you get a period of drought following the end of this pluvial, and this is another quote from the actas, but basically people started to leave Tlaxcala and abandon these maguey fields because they were essentially starving. Because with the onset of this sort of hotter, drier period and the erosion caused by this system, truly nothing could grow. And so people sort of abandoned the landscape. And then in the 1800s, you get sort of a return to heavier rainfall and more pluvial events. And you get flooding of rivers. So this is the Zawapan River, used to be surrounded by wetlands. Now those were all basically silted up, and they've had to put these giant retaining walls to prevent flooding. And you get things like giant sinkholes, which result from, you can see, I mean, these are people for scale. This is huge, a huge event, which basically happens when you like silt up wetlands and then start cultivating on them. You can get these sort of pockets of unstable sediment that just collapse to the water table. So I will end there. Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I was happy to see that. Thank you so much.